Okay, so now we're going to jump into the bulk of kind of the overview of what executive function skills actually are, and so that you have a real solid understanding of all of the different areas which this encompasses. And so, really, when we talk about executive functioning, we're referring to everything that's kind of going on in that prefrontal cortex and that front lobe of the brain that's actually controlling how the brain communicates kind of within itself and how we really process information. So, when we're talking about executive function skills specifically, we're looking at how these processes actually influence how we manage not just our academic lives for students, but also our personal lives, our behavioral choices, our ability to self regulate, all the way across the board, so both in and out of school. These functions actually control how we retrieve and process information we've already learned. So we might be kind of learning and storing information as we go, but have difficulty calling on it when we need to, or working through all the steps and the different processes involved in really applying a particular concept. They also look at, or they control how we synthesize or pull together ideas or make connections. So we'll have a lot of students who do really, really well on a very specific and minute concept. So they'll understand kind of the basics of, let's say in math, chapter 1.1, and they'll do well on the quiz, and chapter 1.2, and they'll do well on the quiz. And then we'll get along to the chapter test where we're covering sections 1.1, 1.2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And the questions are kind of mixed up, and then they have a lot of difficulty really looking at a different context or a larger problem and calling on all of those individual ideas and tying them together to answer a more advanced problem. So we're really looking at how the information is being interconnected and then accessed and utilized. So it's rather involved when we're talking about it. And a lot of people often think of executive functioning just as a student's ability or an individual's ability to plan, organize, and manage time. And of course, those are very important facets of executive functioning, but they really control so much more. It's also responsible for how we break down tasks. So that would be called task analysis, how we look at what needs to be done, and then how we kind of break that into smaller steps and action items so that we can actually initiate. So again, task initiation, getting started on the actual task, put them in order and sequence. So what step is going to be done first? And let's say, for example, we use recipes a lot because it's a great, just kind of simple, practical example, even though it's a very multi-step process. We talk about, would it really make any sense for us to start to mix up ingredients without first checking the recipe, or figuring out if we even have all the ingredients that we need, or making a list and going to the store. So we've got to get these all in order and then kind of break them down into action steps and a process before we can actually engage in step one. And then the execution, of course, of those tasks. So how are we going to actually follow and complete steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 until we actually reach completion or the final product? So a lot of steps involved in that task analysis, initiation, and execution, and so many things that we find troubling for students and for individuals. As they move along throughout that process, they can get stuck in any one of those areas, whether that's just being overwhelmed with how to even break down a task. And many people do even get overwhelmed with simply making a grocery list or going to the store or figuring out how to break down a project. We kind of get stuck right off the bat with not even knowing how to break it into steps. Or we'll have some who can break it into the manageable steps. For example, the recipe. We know that we need to find a recipe, make a list, check ingredients, go to the store, come home, get the materials out, etc. But then when it comes to getting started, we get stuck in those first steps, or there's a panic or a second guessing of something. And then there could be also all kinds of obstacles or glitches as we move along throughout the process. Maybe we don't know how to convert a certain measurement and we're stuck, or we don't have the right ingredient that we thought we did and we've got to find a substitution. How do we actually manage that? So that kind of comes in later when we talk about that self-regulation and learning to anticipate and predict and prepare for when things don't go right and then get back on track, and having the resources and the ability to be able to problem solve around that. That's all part of this executive functioning. The obvious one is our fourth bullet point here, where it says how we plan, or we look at how we plan, organize, and manage our time. And those are the most commonly associated terms when we think of executive functioning, or we hear that. Most people think of using a planner or an assignment notebook or a way to track our calendar, or organizing our materials or our belongings, or managing our time and actually accomplishing the task that we set out to do. So that's kind of the more traditional view many have of executive functioning, but it's just, as you can see, one small component. There's also a sustained attention component that kind of goes hand in hand with kind of that entire right side column, where we're talking about the ability not just to focus and sustain throughout without getting distracted or flitting from one thing to another, not making simple mistakes due to our inability to kind of keep that focus where it needs to be, and then the self-regulation piece. So what happens when something does get in our way? We're not sure how to prepare for a test. We might get stuck on a problem. We might be in a social situation and we're not really sure how to kind of step back and analyze and call on the right strategy for communicating. So this kind of encompasses a really wide variety of things. And adapting to change, that's a difficult one for a lot of the students and families and individuals that we work with. When something does change or an obstacle does arise, how are we going to adapt and adjust our plans and our structures for managing and dealing with that situation? And then problem solving tends to be a very, very big challenge for many of the individuals with executive functioning challenges. Really kind of figuring out, again, how to make that adaptation when something is problematic, and then what can we do in the future when that arises. So learning to kind of anticipate and prepare in advance for things. All of these different areas kind of fall under the realm of executive function skills. And we do look at, and we'll talk about that in this course as well, we do look at the academic component because, of course, to do well in academics does require the ability to manage in all of the areas that we have listed and we're talking about here. But also it's important that we help students to understand how these, kind of come into play when we're talking about managing schoolwork, completing homework, writing a paper, working through a math problem, performing on a test, specific study skills. So we're going to give all different types of strategies and approaches that we can use across those areas as well as we work you through this. And just a few more notes on executive function skills. I think it's really important to note that, like I said, we don't just want to look at this as organization, planning, and time management. Yes, absolutely, hands down, we'd like to start with those because they're a little bit more concrete. But they also include all of these steps that are required for us to actually reach a goal or carry out a complete task. And then executive functioning really, we do need to look at the ability to transition and shift because a lot of students, we can create all these great plans, but shifting into actually accessing and using that plan or transitioning from one task to the next, such as from school to relaxing to homework, can be very challenging for many individuals. The skills here, they really do apply to everyone. We're not just talking about students. We all have areas that, we're discussing and that we'll be talking about in this course where, we particularly might have a challenge. We have areas of strength as well. And I do want to point out, they really are a better indicator of an individual's success, so much more so than intelligence or academic ability alone. And I mentioned this in my introduction video. There's a lot of research out there to support this as well. IQ, there is not a strong correlation with higher IQs and strong executive functioning skills, as one would think. It's interesting how many students come to us that are very, very bright, many of the students that we work with, but who have difficulty in managing all of these areas we're talking about, and therefore are really struggling to get through school or perform on tests or interact or really carry out basic life activities, and that's greatly impacting their ability to feel confident and successful. And so what we're looking to do here is talk about how they can develop these skills that they need and kind of the coping mechanisms and these abilities to manage long-term and really become productive and successful and confident members of society and eventually, the workforce. So lots of different things that we're looking at. It does really, in the second to last bullet point, executive functioning skills really do impact all areas of life. We're not just looking at doing well in school. We're talking about participating in sports, socializing and interacting with others, getting out the door in the morning. Every daily function we carry out requires executive function skills. It isn't so important for me, the very last bullet point, also to mention that we make sure that the individual's addressing any underlying issues or concerns. Otherwise, all the tools and strategies we're talking about in this course here aren't necessarily going to be effective or able to be accessed, because if we have a student who has some underlying anxiety or depressive tendencies or significant communication disabilities or deficits, we're going to have a lot of trouble getting them to fully not just buy in, but fully implement and execute all of these different techniques if they are struggling and they've got something kind of top level blocking or getting in their way. So I want to make sure that we kind of pay very close attention as we're working with students and individuals to how much is due to a lack of executive function skills versus how much is due to an additional or contributing factor. So I want to make sure that those are at the very least being addressed concurrently with the appropriate professional, and that may be you and you're just working executive functioning or it might be that we have a team of individuals working with this particular student or person. So I just want to make sure that we highlight that, and we'll be pointing that out as we go along. There are so many steps involved with executive functioning too, so I do want to kind of just give a quick example here, and I picked 6 or 7 of these to highlight. Of course, I could have made probably a 20-page list. there are so many steps involved in everything we do that require executive functioning. For example, just emptying the backpack alone can be a challenge, because when students get home after the end of a full day, they have all kinds of materials there. Things throughout the day kind of pile up. There could be wrappers from lunch and pencils and pens and crumpled up papers that are shoved in the bag. There's homework to be completed. There are papers to be filed. There are textbooks. There might be personal belongings. And by the end of the day, sometimes that's all just kind of floating around. So it's great. We think emptying your backpack is just one step, right? We take everything out, all done. But that's really not how it works. If you think it through, obviously, there are so many steps required just to kind of take out all the items, to mentally be able to categorize and organize those, then to make decisions about where each of those items needs to be filed or located, then to get yourself moving in the direction of putting them in those places, pulling out the action items, and then taking action on those pieces, such as completing homework or filling out paperwork or a form. So we look at all of these individual tasks, like cleaning your room, just organizing the paper component alone, getting through the entire homework process, often with multiple subjects. There are so many steps required. This can be absolutely overwhelming for students. Learning how to study, the majority of students we find coming to us, regardless of their ability levels, really don't have a solid understanding as to what exactly and specifically they can do to be able to effectively and efficiently study, so that they're actually applying and transferring that information and knowledge on the assessment or test. So getting out the door in the morning kind of goes without saying. Some individuals, no issues at all, and others can get hung up any step along the way, and something that could take 2 minutes, like getting out of bed, turns into a 15, 20-minute, 30-minute production, causing things to kind of derail really quickly. I even do have a workshop that I did on processing, and I think we'll probably be bringing that back out soon if it's not already up on our site by the time you've seen this, on how individuals process information. And we've got the ability to answer one test question, let's say a multiple choice test question, for example, I have broken down into 8 steps. So just for the student to be able to actually read it, process it, break it down, interpret and translate what the words mean, call on the information, then look at the multiple choice answers, and then repeat that process for each of those answers, and then directly connect or synthesize and call on the information so that they can apply the knowledge needed to be able to choose the right answer. Many, many steps involved in something seemingly so simple, such as answering one test question, and it's so much more. So lots of steps involved with this, and I just want to kind of paint that picture. In many of the areas we're working with students on are even more complicated than that, kind of overhauling an entire planning system, learning strategies for managing their time or self-regulating, learning how to break down large or overwhelming tasks or projects, right? So all of these things we're talking about are very multi-step processes, and the more we focus on that and help students streamline their approach, the better results we're going to have. Okay, so I'm going to jump into a section here on executive functioning challenges, and really looking at what are some signs. And again, this is one where I could have put probably 30 slides together, but let's highlight. A lot of these students, doesn't mean that they actually necessarily have each and every one of these that we're going to see, but they appear to be lazy at times, or their parents will describe them as lazy, difficult, resistant, or they say that they don't care, or they seem to not really care, but truly deep down at the end of the day, the majority of students we work with, they do really care. They just, I think, sometimes get to a point where they've tried so many things for so long, or they've tried to do it a certain way and it didn't work, that they kind of just quit and gave up. So that's one that we see or we hear very frequently, which is typically not true or not the case. It's not that they're fundamentally trying to be difficult or not caring or being lazy. We really often see their effort levels not matching the outcome. We'll have students who come in here and they really are pulling all the stops, they're spending 4 hours studying, they're writing in their planner, but they're not getting the results that they need. Multi-step instructions, we've mentioned kind of this multi-step piece. A lot of these students have trouble following multi-step instructions, or along the way they get stuck in this very tiny step for some very specific reason, and then it again derails the entire process, or they just have difficulty remembering those. So if we were to ask a child even at home, sometimes even older individuals, hey, can you run upstairs and grab X, Y, and Z? They run upstairs, they might grab X, they may get distracted, they may come back down, but completely forget about Y and Z. So that can be something that we see. A lot of these individuals, very, very smart, but we see lower grades than what we would expect, and or variable performance, where they'll do really, really well on one test and bomb the next one, or they'll do really well in one area or one subject and then not so well in the others. For many of these individuals, even the simplest tasks in the world, and we mentioned a few of those in the previous slides, seem to be very difficult or take forever. Things that we think are kind of common sense or second nature, can sometimes turn into great productions and or even trigger emotional responses. We sometimes see this where it looks like a difficulty with the content itself, but really it's actually difficulty in the process. And so we'll have a lot of students when they're writing or working on math problems, and because the grades aren't as strong, parents are coming to us, or we're talking with teachers and professionals, and the concern is that either they just have an issue with learning math or math difficulty, or that they aren't good with writing and they need a writing tutor or a math tutor. But in reality, when we kind of dig down into it, the reason for the grades being lower or for the outcomes not being where they want typically have more to do with their ability to carry out the task in an appropriate way and have the right process and the most efficient approaches in place. So those are the different things that we're going to be sharing with you some ideas for as we move throughout the course. Other things that we see: difficulty with self-regulation, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. Lots of times just getting derailed and not having a strategy for getting back on track. Avoidance, procrastination, those are big ones that we see with the self-regulation. The social media, the cell phone, the Xbox, I would say at the time of this video recording, Fortnite is a big one. The brain kind of gets just sucked in, and the difficulty with managing time and self-regulating gets in the way of individuals being able to kind of stop and change direction and make that transition into something else that they need to be doing that's productive. Not that there isn't any productivity in doing those and having some downtime, but really being able to regulate around that is where we see these students having a challenge. Many of our students are also disorganized, and that could be a disorganization with their materials. So that could be the backpack is a mess, the folders and the papers aren't organized, the pages are falling out of the binder, there's things crammed and crumpled and stuffed everywhere, or it could be that we don't have a good way to organize and process information. So when we're talking about writing papers or kind of keeping track of computer files, that can be a challenge for a lot of kids as well. Missing or late work is a big one, of course, and we don't see this with everyone, but many of our students have difficulty just due to either lack of awareness or lack of an appropriate way to organize or manage all of the different expectations and assignments. Can be a real challenge for a lot of our students, not turning in the work. And we can pick each one of these apart into a great level of detail, or into many different reasons. It could just be they didn't recognize the assignment was due. It could be due to avoidance and procrastination. It could be due to them forgetting to turn it in. It could be because they lost it. It could be because they didn't feel like it was good enough. It could be that they turned it into the wrong location. There's a lot going on now with schools managing different modes of communicating information or assignments, and so we have many still working with paper, and then many working on not just one but multiple platforms that they're using online for submitting or assigning work. And sometimes that can vary when we're talking about middle school and high school and college students from teacher to teacher. So we might have 15 different websites to manage in addition to papers and physical products that need to be turned in. So it can be extremely overwhelming when we don't have a streamlined process for each individual school year. And a lot of what we see too is that there is a lack of awareness or surprise to even knowing what the expectation was from the outset. So you'll hear a lot of times like, oh my gosh, as we're checking grades, I didn't know we were supposed to do that. I didn't know. And it's even that awareness of where to go. How do you know from each teacher where they post the assignments? Where do they put the due dates? How do you turn it in? Where do you turn it in? When does it need to be turned in? So there are a lot of things that come into play when we're talking about science, and those are just a few of the common ones that we see when we're working with students.